Should we start with the Etna Bianco and talk about that specifically?
Yeah, let's start with that and the
Yeah.
grapes that make it up, but also about the terroir because I did want to ask you. We started talking about around the globe. I think people who are a little bit nerdy about wine understand kind of what clay is and what limestone is, or gravel or sand. But when they hear volcanic soil, they go, well, what does that mean? What is it?
Mm.
How dense is it? How light is it? What is how does it work?
Yeah. I think the thing to think about with all soils is water retention. Because I think beyond that, we start splitting hairs to a degree that it becomes very case by case scenario. And I think as a wine lover, the thing to think about with volcanic soil versus clay soil, which would be kind of the on the other end of the spectrum, really, is when it rains and you have precipitation to feed the plants. Um, does that water go deep underground, or does it kind of get soaked up like a sponge and just sit there? Clay has this absorbent property to it that it really holds on to water pretty well. That's why you see clay typically on flatter land, or slightly, more gradual slopes is where you might see that. And clay is oftentimes formed from deposits, right? So gravity pulling things down. So it naturally makes sense. When you're on a volcanic slope, and a true slope, as the Etna vineyards are, and not only that, but oftentimes terraced, where humans have come in, they've made the land flat for their vines, they've put up walls. When it rains on there, it will go deep underground, and so the roots go deep underground, and so the roots end up having just a very different um, kind of exposure to the nutrients that are in the ground, to the organic materials that are in the ground. The uptake of what's in there is different. And you also have to think volcanic soil is going to foster a very different biome of subterranean life, microbes, of insects, of worms, of all those other things. It's like the difference between a rainforest and the tundra, right? Like
Sure.
clay is going to have a very different biome for those kinds of microbes and everything. So it's super complicated, and I don't want to get too hung up on,
Yeah.
oh, because it's volcanic and its exposure to this much amount of potassium or whatever that might be. I think from a wine standpoint, that whenever you have that formula where water goes deep underground and the roots have to really chase it, you end up having a plant that seems to work in a little bit more of an efficient manner. And that efficiency usually shows up with grapes that have a little bit more raciness to them, a little bit more zip. And this is really when we start getting into this space called minerality, right? Which is a word that is kind of controversial because it's not really a word. But let's be honest, we've used it enough now. We could call the Oxford English Dictionary and say minerality is a word now.
Yeah.
Minerality to me is a sensation, and it's every bit as much of an emotional feeling in a wine as it is a technical feeling. So it's basically the kind of thing that would conjure a sense of stoniness, of kind of like atmospheric conditions, of salt. When you kind of experience those things in a wine, and when you really pay attention to a wine and get them, it's just kind of it's an interesting space that's really hard to pin down.
That's a
It's
good
not like,
segue into this Bianco.
yeah, and that's what Etna Bianco is absolutely known for minerality. I mean, if you wanted to ask, 10, master sommeliers, what two wines, what three wines in the world best demonstrate minerality, they would probably say Chablis and Etna Bianco,
Yeah.
because of how regularly these two wines showcase this attribute. Now, Chablis is in a form of limestone, but it's a similar kind of action that's happening there. The water is going really, really deep into that limestone. Those Chardonnay vines are really, really chasing the water. So here on Etna, I haven't even gotten to the grape that we're talking about.
Yeah, let's do
The
that.
chief grape is Caricante, local grape. So Caricante means to carry. And the reason it's known as to carry is because it gives a lot of yield. So, normally we think a lot of yield, that doesn't really mean a fine wine. But when you have older vines of Caricante growing in these conditions, the yield balance is just right. And Caricante is complemented oftentimes by Catarratto. It's complemented by Minella. There's a few other local Sicilian varieties that we don't really need to get too hung up on. In fact, I would say another key thing that's important to know about Etna's wines is that many of these are field blends. So the exact percentages of what grapes we're drinking are not oftentimes defined for us on a tech sheet in the industry. So,
So just for explanation, when you say
yeah,
field blend, these are just kind of growing together, and then they just go in and harvest them together. They're
mhm,
mixed in and intertwined.
exactly. Exactly. I mean, in some of the vineyards I was in with the winemaker, hey, what's this? What's this? Is this Catarratto? It could be Catarratto. It's not. It's not Caricante.
Yeah.
They don't know. They don't know because they're so old. And this is how. This is the old way of doing agriculture. Was you diversity was a good thing. You wanted a lot of variety of plants in a small space so that you could have a lot of variety, so that you could have resistance against maladies and climate conditions. So a lot of the older vineyards on Etna are not fully understood in terms of which grapes they're producing. With confidence, with a high degree of confidence, most of them are going to be Caricante on the white side of things, Norello Mascalese on the red side of things, and they are. It is known that those are the majority of grapes. But in an Etna Bianco, it's not uncommon that 10% of it is a mix of some sort of milieu of local Sicilian white varieties, Catarratto being the most common of those.
So when we dive into this Bianco and we know the grape now, what should we? I mean, you mentioned Burgundy earlier, and you mentioned Chablis, and I'll tell you when I nosed this the first time, it screamed Chablis to me. That's the first thing I thought of. But I did love that the minerality to me on the nose on this was up front. It wasn't
Yeah.
fruit; it was the minerality that struck me first, which I really enjoy on all wines, but specifically white wines.
Yeah, yeah, and a Bianco is going to be really giving you a sense of sapidity. So, like you want to have another sip. You just want to consume something else with it, right? There's
Yeah.
this. So that to me, that's the momentum that Etna Bianco builds so well. Chablis does that very well as well. There are a few aromatic signatures that are a little bit different. I kind of feel oftentimes like Etna Bianco is a little bit stonier. Sometimes it can convey a little bit more of like a briny kind of smell, like an oceanic smell. That again, what's causing that? I hesitate to even guess because I'm not a scientist, right? But you do wonder if on that east slope, given the closeness to the Strait of Messina, the fog conditions that come off of that strait, if that has something to do with it. Typically these wines are going to lead with some of those stonier elements first, and then you'll notice the fruit a little bit later. And I've even noticed with some of these Etna Bianco wines that they move in a dynamic way. And this is something I think is very different than Chablis. Is from 1 minute to the next, it's a different wine. It's
Yeah.
always a compelling wine, but you come back to it and you go, that wasn't like the last sip, or you pour yourself a second glass an hour after you open the bottle and you're like, whoa, this has changed. Now it's really fruity, or now I'm really getting a sense for flowers, or gosh, that sip was really salty, right? Like this, there's not actually salt in the wine, but it has that sensation to it. It creates
Sure.
that sort of thing. So I've even had, one of Benanti's wines, their Contrada Rinazzo, which is a larger parcel with Pietro Marina in the middle of it, which is their most famous wine. That wine, one time I opened it and it didn't smell like anything. It was like, I was like, oh God, is there something wrong with the wine? And I was like, I've never had that before, where a white wine was so closed that it just was like there was just kind of this like
Yeah.
pause, right? And then it, like the volcano, it just, oh, here it is, and it was just the most incredible wine because it was so filled with aromas. There were so many moving parts to it that were just really dynamic and interesting. And I think that kind of element makes this such an exciting place to be. I like being in spots where I don't know what's going on. I mean, I maybe I'm unique as a wine expert in that regard, that I don't have every answer, but Etna is one of those places that continuously tells you, Hey, there's a lot going on here that you're too small to understand.
Yeah, well, and I was going to mention, you brought it up, but the floral notes, that's kind of what I get as a secondary. I don't get as much of that fruit. I do get it back there, a little bit of that stone fruit, but I get this kind of perfumey, kind of white flower kind of note that I'm getting on it. The other thing I would say is it's got a little weight to it. It's not as
Mhm.
crisp. It's got. I like the weight on this. The kind of
Yeah.
the mouthfeel.
Yeah. It's not a, it's not at all like Vermentino or, some of these other white wines that we know and have, explored. Certainly, it's nothing like Sauvignon Blanc.
No.
Um, yeah, I mean but it's also it's not like Chardonnay, and the reason why is because Chardonnay is such a blank canvas, and it allows the winemaker to make so many different decisions. Whether they oak it, those kinds of things. And certainly, there's a whole variety of techniques being employed by these winemakers, whether it's oak, whether it's the use of acacia, whether it's concrete, stainless, amphora. They're experimenting with it all on Etna, but there's a character here that overrides that, if so to
Yeah.
speak, that I think shines with Etna Bianco in a way that's really intriguing.
Yeah. Delicious wine. I mean, very, very good. The acidity, the balance in this wine. I mean, a really stunning wine. And I don't know what this costs, but I'm guessing $30 range, $35 range, or is that somewhere
I
where we
think it might even be a little bit less than that.
less
Yeah.
than that?
Yeah. Let's look it
That's a
up right now because
steal.
we're on a podcast. We got to get this right. I should have looked
Yeah.
this up beforehand. Um, Real quick, the retail price on it is I'm seeing it being sold for $29. So yeah, it's around 30
30
bucks.
bucks. Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
steal.
Yeah, a great value for what you get. The Etna Rosso is even a little bit less than that. It's around $27, $28 in that range, which we'll get to in a second. So, a couple other things on Etna Bianco, I think that really make it so unique is the persistence after. So the finish, it just keeps carrying and going on and going on. That makes it very intriguing. But I've also, and I wrote about this recently on Opening a Bottle, the aging possibilities with Etna Bianco are really intriguing. So I've kind of come around to the idea that what's exciting for me as a personal wine collector is white wines that are really thrilling after 5 years.
Uh,
Not looking at things like, oh, what can I lay down that I'll enjoy 40 years from now? Like, I'm already
yeah.
45.
Yeah.
Like I want some results now, right? And this is really where Etna Bianco has a leg up on a lot of other white wines. Is what it does in that 5 year, even 10-year time frame is really, really intriguing. I had some examples at Etna Days that were 10 years old, and this is a wine that's got incredible aging potential. I wouldn't be surprised even if 20 years from now people are talking about 30-year-old Etna Biancos as being really, really compelling. So it's not that it only lasts for 5 years, but you're actually going to really see some noticeable changes in it in 5 years. So that to me is a fun thing to manage is, a rack of 4 different Etna Bianco that I just keep for 5 years and roll them out. And if I forget about them after 5 years and I try them 7 years, they're still going to deliver some results to me. They're still going to be more, complex and nuanced and intriguing after that window. So something to kind of keep in mind is if you've got any collectors listening in, that it's a really interesting wine for that.
No, I think that's great to know because so many times we hear with white wines, 3 to 5 years, drink them. As a general rule, not this, doesn't apply to every wine, but it's
Yeah.
good to know that this wine, you would say after 5 years to that 10-year mark is just a fun window to really kind of, maybe buy 3 or 4 of these and open one at 5 and 7 and 9 and,
Right.
just see what it's like.
But a lot of times too, with wines we talk about aging, they require aging, right? Like, oh, it's
Sure.
released, you don't want to open it yet. And these wines aren't like that. These wines you can open right at release.
Yeah.
Save them for 3 years. You can save them for 6 years. You can save them for 10. I mean, go for it. All the properties are there for a really solid age-worthy wine, especially from some of the top producers on the island, which we can talk about a little bit later.
Yeah, I need to put them in the back of the cellar because they're so good. If they're in front of me and I see the label, I'm probably going to pull it and want to drink it. So I probably need to hide them a little bit.
Yeah, not a bad idea.